Okay, so you must have your bell ringer done if you're watching this video. And again, remember to watch the video for the bell ringer, please. Make sure you watch the video. And you have your guided notes pulled up. So what we're going to talk about today, actually let me go back so we can read it. Today we're going to be able to discuss how Earth's constructive and destructive processes have changed the Earth's surface. So I hear two new words for us, constructive and destructive, but honestly, between you and I, the standard is really easy, so I don't worry about us flying through this. So we have processes that are called destructive and processes that are constructive. So those constructive processes, if I could type, are processes that are just going to create or build up landforms on the earth. So anytime new land is being made on earth, that is a constructive process. That's easy because you can think of construction workers. They build things. So if it's constructive, something is being built up. The opposite of constructive is that destructive processes. So we've heard of destruction. So if you destroy something, you're going to break it down, push it over, like this bird pushing over these pile of cups. I don't know what they did to him, but he doesn't want them to be up. So destructive processes are going to actually break down any landforms on the earth. So what do I mean by all this? What are some good examples? Let's first talk about constructive processes. What are a few examples of things that build up the earth? Well, first, we talked about this last week. We talked about that sea floor spreading. And I know this is a little tricky, so let me go over it quickly again. It's when those two plates are going to separate or spread in the sea floor, and that hot magma is going to come up from the crack that's going to be created after they separate, and that magma is going to cool and harden and become a nice rock at that mid-ocean ridge. So since we're creating rock, we're making new crust, we are building up landforms, so this is going to be a constructive process. Another good example of a constructive process is, this is a new word for us, something called deposition. Now that sounds really fancy, deposition. What is that? All it's saying is that any sediment that has been broken off of something, any sediment that is going to be laid down in a new place, that's deposition. So not the actual breaking off of the rock, because that's breaking down rock, so that would be destructive, but the actual laying of the sediment, like if you watch this video, see how that sediment lays down and adds on to any sediment that's already there, any piles of sand or dirt. The actual laying down is going to be constructive because you're building up that landform. Now, this can happen because of floods. If a flood comes through and carries that sediment to a new place, that can cause deposition to happen. Or landslides, which we may have heard of landslides before, maybe not, but it's when large pieces of land actually slide, which we're going to talk about it in a little bit. So deposition is also constructive. This is where it gets a little wild. You knew it was coming. We can't just have one normal set of guided notes. Something weird has to happen. Volcanic eruptions can be constructive. Now, I know what you're thinking. I feel like a volcano erupting wouldn't build up much, but it's true, it can happen. So if you have a volcano that is underwater, okay, a volcano that is underwater, maybe you didn't know that could happen, but it's true. So if we're under the ocean and we have a volcano and it erupts, so that magma turns into lava because it's now out of the earth, that lava comes up, that lava can cool and harden to form new rocks. So if it's underwater, that volcano is going to turn into an island. I know, think about it. The magma comes up, it cools, it hardens, so now on top of that ocean we have solid rock. So a volcanic eruption can totally be constructive because it can make an island. Kind of crazy. So moving on, those are our constructive processes. If you have that seafloor spreading, the deposition, volcanic eruptions, those are constructive. Let's get to destructive, and we have a few more destructive than we do constructive. So this is something we talked about when we talked about the rock cycle. So we have weathering and erosion. That is definitely going to be a destructive process. So weathering is when water, wind, ice, rain weather is going to break down types of rock. So if you look at this first one here, we've got a lot of wind, we've got a lot of rain, and it's chipping away at this landform, and that rock breaks down. So right here we have a lot of destruction. It's being destroyed. So that's a destructive process. Or we might not think about this very much because in Mississippi we don't get a ton of ice. But if you have water fill in like a crack in a rock and freeze, when it freezes it can expand a little bit. So get too big for wherever that water was sitting, and it can cause that rock to break off just like that. So weathering and erosion is definitely destructive. Now, whenever that new sediment lands, I know this part can be a little bit tricky. Whenever that new sediment lands, this right here is that deposition. So down here, we have that constructive process happening. But up here, where it's actually breaking, is destructive. So here's destructive, deposition is constructive. Okay, two other destructive processes. Here is that landslide that I was talking about. It's kind of scary if you're ever driving down a road that looks like this. Maybe you've even seen a sign that says like beware of falling rocks. I know a lot of roads that look like this have those signs, and this is why. Gravity, believe it or not, just gravity can eventually pull down those rocks if they get too built up, and eventually it just becomes too heavy and it comes crashing down. So that is a landslide, because look at it, it's literally sliding down. So that's being destroyed, so it's destructive. Those floods can also be destructive. So if you have a flood come through, like look at this tree, it is being completely destroyed, or it can take out other large pieces of land. So a flood can also be destructive. So landslides and floods can be both constructive and destructive, because here obviously they're being destroyed, but they can help up here in that deposition where they're carrying that sediment to a new place. So floods and landslides are both constructive and destructive. Okay, the last two destructive processes I want to talk about. This one makes a little bit more sense when we're talking about volcanoes. At least in my brain it makes more sense. Volcanoes can also be destructive because when that volcano erupts and that hot lava sits on the ground, it can actually catch a lot of it on fire or completely burn or melt it up. So that's obviously destroying it. If it turns into a rock and creates new crust, that's constructive. But if it's burning or melting something, that's destructive. The last one, I think this one is really easy, earthquakes. Obviously, when you got a big earthquake and that earth completely cracks or breaks down, that's destructive because you're totally breaking it up. You're destroying a piece of the earth. That's pretty much it. I put it in a nice little diagram for us to see which ones are constructive, which ones are destructive, and which ones are both, because we talked about a couple that can be both, those landslides, floods, and volcanic eruptions. I would definitely keep this slide handy for tomorrow's assignment. Hint, hint. So that's it. That's all I've got for you. Let me know if you have any questions or if any of this was confusing, and I've got you.